welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Hornsvoden. As always, I do have to plug our Patreon. I know I say it every single week, but it is how we keep the lights on and how we keep the show going. So if you can pop over to Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast, have a look at the different tiers and the different rewards we've got on there. The main one is our Q&A that we do with our guests after every show. We sit down for an extra 20 minutes, half an hour, and the patrons can ask their questions, whether they're submitted ahead of time or in real time by watching the show live. And they're a real nice little bumper and a bonus part of the show. So if there is a show that you like, there's going to be that little add-on piece to it. So if you want a little bit more of it, there will be that Q&A. And the benefit from that doesn't only come from being live and asking your own question. Just listening to those back and hearing the questions that other people have submitted, a lot of the time there is a ton of information, questions that me and Mags have missed. So go have a look at that. It starts from £3 a month, less than a cup of coffee, and we really appreciate it because it does allow us to keep improving the show. And if you can't, then a 5-star rating, positive review wherever you get your podcasts, and then go and check out our YouTube. Hit the little bell, the little subscribe button, so you can see our pretty faces whilst we do them. All the episodes go on there as well. And that's it. Let's get into today's show. So I'm super excited for this one. First, I have to introduce my lovely co-host who's making a return, our in-house archaeologist, Mags Havgar. Mags, welcome back.
Hello, guys. Thank you. Very nice to be back. I'm sorry I missed a few episodes there, but I'm beyond excited to be here for today's topic.
You were living it up in LA.
Yeah, I was very lucky being able to go to LA for my best friend's wedding, which was a blast. And now I am back in the cold, cold northern part of Europe.
Oh, it looked a lot of fun, and you looked fantastic on the pictures. So I hope you had a lovely
thank you.
time.
That's very sweet. It was great. It was amazing. And it was also really fun hanging out with the person I would say that I'm still in touch with, that I've known for the longest, who isn't part of like my biological family. Like we hung out for a little bit. We took some photos before the ceremony, and the photographer suddenly went, "Oh, I can see why she's your best gal," because him and I just suddenly did things in sync without having talked about it first. It's really hilarious. But yeah, I'm really excited to now talk about nerd stuff.
Yeah, they're the real friends though, when you can not see them for years sometimes, and as soon as you do, it's just like you were never apart. But anyway, we have a lovely reoccurring guest, and I think the person with the greatest title in all of scholarship. So we'll get to that. So our guest is Emma Thompson. So Emma is a PhD candidate in Viking Age mortuary identities at the School of Archaeology and Ancient History at the University of Leicester. Emma, welcome back to the show. Was that right? No,
that was great. I just feel like every time you keep bigging up my title, it's just putting so much pressure on the thesis now.
That's only because I'm into really morbid stuff. I'm into like really morbid horror films and documentaries about true crime.
If it helps, Emma, the chat and Dan had a whole conversation about what they should make my like official title, and they ended on Tapestry Temptress. So
okay, that's way better than mine. I'm sorry, that wins.
No. Oh no, I didn't mean to say not what I was going for. I know what you mean with like heightened expectations, because I'm like, oh shit, I don't really know if my knowledge will live up to that, but sure.
Okay, yeah. So Emma, you were on I don't know, a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago at this point. I don't know, time flies at this point.
What even is time?
Well,
oh God,
isn't that just a conversation? But we spoke about Repton and the burial there. But this time we're going to look at Viking burials as a whole. And what I think, when we spoke kind of off air, even just the brief little us touching on topics really got me thinking. So that's why I'm excited for this, because it's the idea of what is, I guess, a Viking burial, how we identify it, and especially this idea of when people start to assimilate and cultures start to mix, how you then find a grave and look at it and identify it and say, this is Viking versus maybe an Anglo-Saxon who has found or traded for some Viking goods that they'd like. Am I on the right path?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Wonderful. Is there a point you think we're best jumping off at, or like, is there like an
I
an
so I
umbrella?
think because this is such a big, like this kind of question keeps coming up in Viking archaeology, sort of again and again, like what is a Viking grave, basically? And that applies both in the sense of Scandinavia and sort of when the Vikings start going abroad to England and whatnot, because we're really desperate to have a diagnostic, stereotypical Viking grave. But even in Scandinavia, there's never a Viking grave, I think, as Neil Price has sort of famously said. So you can kind of take your pick of where you want to poke at that from, because we can look at it from lots of different angles. Because yeah, what is a Viking grave at the end of the day?
Is it like we've kind of now in current times tried to make this like a very static form of, like you said, diagnostic, that the past just doesn't want to conform to, you'd say?
I think we've got this real need for categories, which has kind of come out of the Victorian era a lot, because we've sort of gone, this is this and that's that, and sort of this is Viking, so we can differentiate that from something that's Anglo-Saxon. But actually, when you start poking at just that Viking idea, let's sort of focus on Scandinavia, a Danish grave, and again, that's still Denmark being, a big sort of range of graves, is going to look quite different to a Norwegian or a Swedish grave. So we like the neatness because it helps us sort of summarize and simplify. But actually, as soon as you start trying to talk about, I guess, case studies rather than something general at large, it loses a lot of that simple, cremated boat grave means Viking, when actually that's just quite a visual sort of thing in the media rather than in practice that we sort of know happens.
Okay, so I think we have to kind of almost define what Viking is to be able, because
sorry, I'm sorry.
Oh dear.
Well, that's the thing.
I was like, should we start? Like, are we gonna? Yeah. I'm sorry. No, Dan, keep going.
But that is because I don't know why this just came to my head, was that if a Viking is buried in Scandinavia, is he still a Viking? Is that still because if we say a Viking by what people know the word to mean is somebody who goes raiding, would you have to die whilst on a raid and then be buried to be a Viking grave? Because if you go back home and you just settle back into farming life, are you still a Viking? Do you keep that moniker after you've raided, just because you've been raiding? Is it something that sticks with you?
That's a cool philosophical thought.
Yeah, so this kind of, even more so than the what is a Viking grave, what is a Viking, is following around anyone who wants to talk about this subject. And it's the kind of thing that every person doing a PhD on Viking stuff has to have a paragraph in there somewhere saying, when I say Viking, what I mean is,
I am a part of this group and I'm having a hard time.
Yeah. Okay. Let's for the purpose of this episode, let's say a Viking is somebody who is either, I would say, left Scandinavia and come to let's say England to raid, and then the generations after that. So anyway,
that's an interesting one, because then that kind of cuts off your early Viking age. So this is why it's such an interesting topic, because there's kind of Viking with a capital V, which is sometimes how people talk about it, in that it's a categorization, the Viking age, we've made that. Well, there's Viking with the lowercase v, which is this is the profession, this are people who are going a Viking. I sort of, myself and a lot of people who I work with, kind of do this, Viking age, people who lived in sort of Scandinavia, moving about in this time period, with all the caveats that it's not a great term. And sort of it's a period of time that's being defined by a very sort of small subset of people of the place and time. So we can go with that definition. Some people might argue with it, but we can go with it.
I'm just trying to get us some sort of okay. Well, let's, at least when talking about maybe England, because for what fascinates me is this idea of how you pinpoint what would be a quote unquote Viking grave versus a local grave, especially as we know things do start to become a little bit more integrated and religions change So how do you then say this is somebody who them or their family originated in Scandinavia versus somebody maybe?
Yeah.
I think in that context, that's what I'm interested in. So if we maybe go with
we'll
that.
use that.
And then if we look at, and then I would assume when you look at Scandinavia itself and say a Viking, it would just be somebody from the Viking Age. Because how would you know whether they went a Viking? I don't, help, Max, help.
I think see, this is I don't know if you're familiar with this feeling, Emma, but I always feel that like when it comes to stuff like this, I'm always like super nervous that another colleague will just not agree with my definition.
I don't have that problem.
But
so
I'd
you
say
whisper it to me and then I'll just hook down on it.
I'll be brave. I'd say that what I did a panel interestingly earlier this right after the summer at Midgard Talks where someone else in the panel kind of said that they empathize with and are definitely also agree with all the problems that the term Viking has, but that ultimately the term isn't going away. So we might as well just kind of deal with that. But they said it in a much more eloquent way. And I really like that. And so, I mean, personally for me, and it's also really interesting then having this discussion with you, Emma, since you're on, kind of the more of the insular side of this, while I'm working with the Norwegian, I wouldn't even say Scandinavian, but like a Norwegian, very isolated Viking Age finds, is that at least the way that I interpret stuff that is labeled Viking within historical and archaeological context usually refers to some sort of cultural markers, be they distinctions of the way someone is buried, or items that is placed in a burial, or types of buildings that are found. So like they try to refer to a specific cultural pattern of some sort.
Yeah, I agree with you in the sense of, the term is there. Are we going to spend more time and confuse more people in trying to nuance the term than just saying, like, this is the term we've got, here is how I'm using it? Because otherwise you just get into sort of this battle that we've kind of seen with the Anglo-Saxon stuff of just, are we making things harder when actually we just want to get more nuanced research out there and maybe we just need to use the term. What I found really interesting is I did a conference in August and there were 3 back-to-back Viking Age papers, and we all defined when the Viking Age starts and ends differently across all 3 sort of papers.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so literally it was back-to-back. I said, I think, a 700 to 1100, kind of just to be neat, and because with some of the dating evidence, you can't get any more specific than that. And then the next person sort of had it sort of start with Lindisfarne, end with the Norman conquest and whatnot. And so it's interesting to see where, even though we're all talking about the same thing, we kind of have different ideas of exactly how we bookend that. But I agree with you. I think it's kind of just this umbrella term that we use to apply to kind of late Iron Age Scandinavia, but that has different sort of complexities depending on where you're looking at.
100%.
Yeah. All right, let's because this is the problem. We could just go around the houses all episode and talk about what is a Viking, and you just don't really.
But could I just like add on then kind of a follow-up to that? Would I be correct when we're talking about Viking mortuary identities? In, for example, what is today Britain, would that, like, my initial just assumption is that we're then talking about graves that has, for example, some sort of cool brooch that is typically defined as a Viking brooch? Or would that assumption kind of be pointing in the right direction? Is that what you mean when we talk about Viking graves outside of Scandinavia, or like what you're dealing with? Or
yeah, to an extent. So I think kind of combining that question a little bit with what you said earlier, Dan, about let's define the Viking as people who came over to England, for example. I think there is some nuance there in the sense of, if we're going with Vikings as a profession as raiders, not everyone who came to England from Scandinavia were Vikings. We've obviously got some women, we've got animals moving and whatnot. So I guess there's a question there of, does a Viking grave in England look different to a Scandinavian grave in England, maybe in the sense of, are we thinking great army graves versus people who came over and settled and whatnot? Max, sort of in response to what you've said, that's kind of where the discourse has been typically, in the sense of scholars have been looking in the graves in England for brooches, knives, sort of swords, the things that look really Scandinavian in terms of art style or craft style and whatnot. And a lot of the kind of issue with that conversation is that we're not finding loads of it. But we know that they came over. So they're sort of in the early 2000s, there was a lot of sort of, where are the Vikings? We know they came over, and we know that they probably stuck around because we see it in place names, we see it in various other settlement bits and pieces, but the graves don't look Viking enough. So there's this sort of question of like, oh, did they just immediately convert and become sort of Anglo sort of Saxon in style? And it's, what I'm doing is looking at sort of nuances of, maybe we're losing a lot of the items in the graves, but stuff like grave orientation, which way it's facing, or certain sort of other practices. Because I think, especially with sort of archaeology, we look for the stuff, right? We look for the cool items that we can go, oh, here's a brooch we can put on display in a museum. Here's something we can get a 3D sort of, model of. And when that's not there, people start losing interest and don't look at sort of all the various other things that go into burying someone. So I'm trying to look at it holistically and say, right, okay, we haven't got as many items in graves as we want, but we do get them sort of elsewhere, sort of people drop them, and just sort of see what else is going on there and how that sort of looks Scandinavian or not. And this idea of, actually, these are different communities coming together and making new practices. It's not necessarily English or Scandinavian anymore. It's Anglo-Scandinavian, or it's something else.
Ooh, so it's like a big pot of a lot of stuff.
It's a cultural gumbo sort of melting pot.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was my most academic phrasing today. A big pot of stuff, and then your add-on with gumbo was just perfect.
So is there some sort of checklist that we look for to define a grave as Viking? If I was to ring you up, Emma, I've been digging in my back garden and I've come across some bones and some bits. I think it might be a Viking. Is there like what we look for? Because you said that this idea that they didn't look Viking enough. Is there kind of like a box you have to check?
So traditionally, kind of the diagnostic criteria would be, in this period in England, we stop seeing as much stuff in the grave. And it's still a bit more complicated than that, because it's stuff that we can see that starts sort of disappearing. So stuff like metal that survives really well in the ground, we stop seeing that as much in English graves. And so if you see a grave where there is a brooch or a sword, so for example, the Repton grave that we talked about, that tends to flag as Scandinavian, because in theory in England at this time, putting stuff in the grave isn't a priority anymore. It's usually the direction they're facing. So sort of once people convert to Christianity, sort of the head is facing where the sun rises, whereas before that it's the other way around. It would be kind of, you don't get this so much in England. There are sort of chambers built for graves in Denmark and sort of Sweden at the time, which you don't see in England. Hogbacks, which are these sort of stone sculptures on top of burial sites, tend to be quite sort of Scandinavian looking in design. We don't really know what's going on with the burials underneath because we're not allowed to dig them up, but that's sort of an example of, Scandinavian influence. So it's art styles, it's stuff in the grave, it's the way the body's facing. Those would be your initial kind of, okay, is this more Scandinavian than not? But I would still argue that even in Scandinavia, you're not seeing complete cohesion with that either. So it's one of those ones.
What?
Yeah. Oh, shocking. Like they don't follow that either. Because even in Scandinavia, so Denmark is where sort of most of my expertise is. Half of the graves in Denmark don't have stuff in either. So even though it's, we kind of look for stuff in graves in England as saying, here are the Vikings, it's not that perfect a checklist either. So it's a, oh, okay, there's stuff here. Let's see if it's Scandinavian, but it's not a perfect, here is a Viking grave. Unfortunately, if it was that neat, my life would be a lot easier.
Okay, so it's not like the people that came over, they brought a specific culture of we bury people like this, and if you find this, then that means so there was a whole different people. People were buried in different ways.
So yeah, so that's kind of the problem. As I said, sort of early 2000s, loads of people were going, where are the Vikings buried in England? Because you weren't getting, these graves with stuff in, whereas you were getting some in Scotland and the Isle of Man. So it's a question of, okay, well, what happened when the Vikings came to England? And it just seems like they followed the patterns of England a lot closer and a lot quicker than anyone was really expecting, which is why we kind of have to start poking at this and looking, well, we know they're here, so why has the burials changed? Like, why have the burials changed to the degree that they have?
But I think that's actually really interesting that I'm not, this is might maybe come off really judgmental towards past researchers and also current researchers, which we're both, part of. But I find that really interesting, like kind of also connecting to what we talked about earlier with, wanting to have criteria and diagnostics and stuff, is having this assumption of there being a pattern that we're missing. But then again, maybe the fact that there's a pattern that's missing is the pattern, because there being so many different ways of burying a person tracks with the rest of Scandinavia, because there are so many ways of being buried in that time period, entirely dependent on geographically, like specifically where you are.
Do you think that's because us today have grown up with you get cremated or you get buried? But even then, though, I've never been to a burial. I've only ever been to cremations. So we have this, probably because of Christianity, we have this very set mindset of people get buried in a casket in the ground with a headstone, and that's it. Versus, or you get cremated. So we're just looking for these like boxes, I guess, of like this is the one thing that they did.
I think, and it's something sort of me and my colleagues talk about quite a bit, is the sense of, in a really weird way, the Vikings feel quite familiar to us because we've grown up with a lot of those stories, and we kind of want to transpose modern familiarity onto the past. So it's sort of really easy to say, like, right, our cremations, our burials, let's think about it kind of in those terms, when actually, they might have been thinking about death and burial very differently. And it's hard to sort of, I guess, translate across time what they're doing versus what we're doing, and where those gaps and sort of differences of ideology are.
Okay.
And I also wonder if there is kind of a long brewing kind of just assumption fallacy related to the kind of the big graves that are talked about a lot, which then creates kind of a false image of what you'd expect. And also because we've talked about this in earlier episodes, Dan, it's really difficult to get a complete picture of all of the burials that we do know of, because there are no, transnational databases that you can just log into and look at a map. You're entirely dependent on specific papers or projects that have published results, and it's really difficult to know whether or not what you have is the complete picture of all the different ways people were buried just in Scandinavia to begin with.
I would also add to that, so for example, where I said the hogbacks, we're not really allowed to go into those burials, so we don't know what's going in under the ground. And unfortunately, soil conditions in a lot of places means that, there isn't a trace left of a burial. So we are missing potentially loads and loads and loads of these burials because they just don't survive anymore. The Midlands, for example, which is where a lot of sort of Viking activity was, the soil's really bad for sort of skeleton preservation and whatnot. So we're missing a lot there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Max, to go back to what you said, I think the layperson probably thinks that every Viking was buried in a ship, or
I mean,
put
to
on
be
a ship
complete,
and sent out to sea, and the arrow was fired, the flaming arrow that we see on so many TV shows. That's probably what a
Yep.
lot of people think. But then equally, I can't remember, was it with Jan that we spoke to, and then I was actually very surprised at how many bow burials there actually were.
it was Christian.
With Christian, yeah. So I think that's two sides almost of the same coin, is that the lay people probably think that everyone was buried on a ship, but then even somebody like me that has quite a good understanding then speaks to somebody, and then I'm thinking, it's probably just the elite. There's not that many of them, and then I find out there's actually quite a lot of ship burials. So it's
And also, not all ship/boat burials were necessarily Viking.
well no, because we spoke with oh, I forgot the gentleman's name last week about Anglo-Saxon with Paul Mortimer. I spoke with Paul Mortimer, and he was telling us about Anglo-Saxon ship burials. So it's all so complex, but that is kind of
the gumbo strikes again.
But that's what I guess that's what you do, Emma, is that you have to go in there and look and go, this is Viking
And
or not.
even just sort of talking about boat/ship burials, there is so much nuance in what that can be. So obviously you've got the big sort of Oseberg ship, which is sort of the massive ship burial. You've got smaller boat burials where boats are kind of used as coffins. You've got Lindholm Hoya, which is a cremation cemetery in Denmark, where they're cremated and they're buried underneath, and then they've got sort of stone ships on top. So there's
Okay, yeah,
lots
I've
of
seen those.
this, lots of this sort of ship boat sort of metaphor in death, but it doesn't have to just be a literal, they're buried in the ship. Sometimes it can be a very sort of metaphorical ship, or it's a coffin that's made of boat planks but isn't sort of boat shaped and whatnot. So even sort of in that boat category, we've got loads of different variations there.
Okay, I'm trying to think, because I imagine you can reduce this down even further, that a chieftain or a king or somebody elite gets buried. That's, I would assume, that's going to be much easier to identify as Viking, because he's going to have a bigger amount of grave goods. He's going to have items that you can probably say these were. But then maybe you would have an ordinary quote unquote Viking who maybe hasn't done that well, or he died on the battlefield and he's buried not with that much, just maybe with what he has with him, just an everyday person. That would be harder to identify. It's that.
Yeah, I mean, so as you said, usually sort of the assumption is the more, and this is very simplified, but the more effort that's gone into the grave, so that could be economic, that could just be, very elaborate building, usually correlates to some sort of status of the individual, because, they could manipulate that money, they could manipulate sort of that social power. So if you've got a grave where it's literally just a body in the ground, no coffin, no stuff with it, it is hard to say what they are, in the sense of this could just be someone who's not buried with much, which sometimes matches sort of conversions to Christianity, where we see less in the grave, or it could be that this person was lower status, or it could be that the grave was robbed, various other pieces. So when you've got a grave where it's just the body, or sometimes not even the body at all, we've got some sort of staining in the soil that suggests someone was there, but it's just an empty sort of cut. It is really hard to know what to do with it. And a lot of archaeology is working around absence, which is fun, but we just sort of have to be careful not to prescribe, either not to use absence as evidence for absence. So just because we haven't found something doesn't mean it wasn't there, but also we have to be careful not to fill those gaps with, not enough sort of tangibility as well.
Do you know how angry I would be if I was a wealthy Viking warrior and I died and was buried, and then somebody stole it all, and when I was discovered 800 years later, everyone was like, he's just a nobody. I'd be so mad.
But this is a thing that I'm working on sort of with a lot of Viking graves. I think for a lot of sort of Viking cultures, there was this expectation that graves might be reopened and stuff might be taken out of it.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Because there are enough examples where graves have been opened and sort of stuff is missing. And there's sort of literature around it, and just thinking about, for example, sort of the Firkat sorceress grave, which is sort of a very sort of well-to-do, in theory, woman's grave in northern Denmark. There's all this sort of very pagan stuff during a time where they're Christianizing, and I've sort of theorized that maybe this stuff was put in the grave with the intention of being taken back out again. And it's something that's coming up a lot at the moment of, are these always graves and burials, or are they sometimes also object hoards? And there's this kind of, human and object hoarding going on with the intention that they might be revisited and reopened. And it's another thing about not making the Vikings parallel to our current burial practices. Like our idea of grave robbing right now is like that's very morally sort of inappropriate and whatnot, but maybe it wasn't for them, and maybe that's why you have got people going back and grabbing stuff.
So
it's not like you have, it's not like I think we've talked about this before, Dan, where I even have beef with the term grave robbing as it kind of refers to the Viking Age practice as well, because that gives you kind of that gives you a Charles Dickensy vibe, doesn't it? Of like people like going out like during the night and be like, oh shit, let's try to dig up a lot of stuff and like sell it. But like you said, Emma, it seems like, if not an institutionalized practice, it seems like a very common practice.
Yeah.
And then that practice not necessarily being looked at as even being bad. It might have been like a bank vault, like in case of emergencies type stuff. Who knows? Like we'll put this with grandma, and then if we need it, we'll go get it.
But also, aren't there examples of like defilement where they would go and take things because it's like, this is our land now? That's a hypothesis. That's a hypothesis. Okay. Yeah. So that, but you would assume that would be, again,
I think what you're referring to
scholarly laws, so I can be like,
no, but I like it. But I think what you're referring to is that Jan that we've talked to, Dan, he has this hypothesis of the re-entry with Oseberg and Gokstad, that is a very geographically specific new person or new people in power defiling burials to make a point, which could very well be the case. I'm not entirely convinced, but I like it. I like the theory.
Okay. How
frustrated are you right now, Dan?
Very. I'm trying to
so sorry.
No, I'm trying to think of the listener and trying to how we could put things. I effectively like try and put things into neat boxes. Although it's,
but can we? I'm gonna actively be the Loki of this conversation and not make that happen.
No, but we can't. But I'm trying. I guess. So
Sorry. Please go on.
Easier to listen to, I guess, so we can put things into some sort of little thing. So if we had, let's say we had a wealthy warrior who was buried with a lot of grave goods, how would you identify him as being, Viking?
It's the warrior got to be a man, Dan.
It could be a she. They.
Okay,
I know what you're doing.
I'm being a really annoying person right now.
We're just throwing devil's advocate out there.
Yeah, we are. But let's say we have a Viking warrior, and he or she or they are buried with a lot of grave goods. So how would you identify that as being a Viking burial over, say, like an Anglo-Saxon king or an Anglo-Saxon chieftain? And how would you then look at, I guess, the goods in there? Because if let's say you've traded, at some point through your life, you've traded with people in Europe, in France, and you've got some really nice items, how would you then attribute them to being in a Viking grave? Because obviously they're not of like Scandinavian origin. Because you would assume that if you traded for something really nice from France or Germany or even, along the Silk Road, you have this item that you really like and you hold dear, you would assume that would be buried with you. And obviously that has no bearing to kind of who you are as a person and your culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. I could really lean into sort of Mag's devil's advocate-ness here, but we'll go simple to start.
You do exactly what you want, Emma. I'm just here to make Dan's life hard.
So sort of first of all, okay, so with this premise, are we saying sort of buried in England, buried in Scandinavia?
Buried in England.
Okay. Buried in England, let's say sort of this time period, you probably sort of look at that and go, right, there's a lot more stuff in this grave than there's normally stuff in an Anglo-Saxon grave, for example. So you'd probably be thinking, well, maybe this is a Scandinavian warrior who's come over. I would argue that warrior graves don't always necessarily mean warriors, but we can go into that later. In terms of if you were trying to find out, is this a Viking raider? If you've got the body, you might do some sort of stable isotope analysis to suggest where they grew up. So you can sort of test the skeleton, see sort of what they were eating, what sort of minerals they were taking up sort of in childhood, and that gives you a suggestion of where they might have come from. Though that can sometimes be a bit tricky because some places look the same as other places.
But it can give you kind of like, it can give you kind of indications of if it's hard to kind of check out exactly necessarily what country they came from, you can kind of say, oh, it looks like this person grew up at the coast because it was a maritime diet in their childhood, or inland because it was mostly like grains and red meats, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So you get a bit of a picture of context, I guess, sort of where this person grew up, how they grew up, and whatnot. Apart from that, if you're sort of saying that the grave goods that they're buried with, they've traded with and they're from elsewhere, that might complicate the picture. It suggests that they've traveled or they've traded. But if it's not sort of a Scandinavian style, you might then be thinking, well, okay, have they come from, have they come from somewhere along the Silk Roads and whatnot? So it's a lot of burial analysis is sort of looking at every little piece of the puzzle you've got and seeing sort of what it's suggesting. And obviously, the more pieces of the puzzle you have, the fuller the picture you can create from it. But it's still kind of guesswork. So the more pieces you've got to play with, the more you can say. But it is about kind of just poking different aspects, which is why people who focus on, does it have objects in the grave as the main line of inquiry, I think are missing a lot of nuance because, were they buried in a coffin? What are the isotopes saying? Various bits and pieces like that. It's not just stuff in the grave, although as archaeologists, we're obsessed with stuff in the grave.
So because obviously you have some Anglo-Saxon burials like Sutton Hoo that have a lot of items in there. Now, granted, that is quite a bit earlier than the Viking. How easy is it to differentiate between really get close to that kind of time period when somebody died? If you found the Sutton Hoo one and you found like a Viking one full of stuff, can you is it possible just to test it and go, okay, this was 800 and this was 600?
So there are a few different things you can do. Whenever you've got something wood that survived in the grave, that's usually your best option because dendrochronology can be really specific. You're basically dating the number of tree rings, and it can get you as specific as like the spring of 982, which is really useful. With other stuff, you can radiocarbon date it, which has various sort of success levels depending on various other things that are going on in the atmosphere at the time. So the problem for a lot of Viking Age stuff is, I think it's around 900 to 1000. When you radiocarbon date something, you do it against this graph that helps you calibrate. And at that point in the graph, it's flat. So it's really hard to actually get you much nuance of dating because everything kind of looks the same as everything else. So Anglo-Saxon, sort of the Sutton Hoo stuff is a bit earlier, so that's a bit easier to date. It's also just knowing exactly what art styles appear at what time, and sort of depending on the layers of the burial, you can say, well, this was buried beneath this thing, which we know is this date, which suggests this is earlier than the stuff above it. What I find really interesting about the English stuff, which I'm starting to get to grips with at the moment, is sometimes late Anglo-Saxon burials, where there's no stuff in it, in theory, can be confused for kind of Roman period stuff because the kind of Middle Saxon, early sort of Anglo-Saxon stuff is so well defined date-wise. The sort of ambiguity of the stuff before and after can sometimes get confused for each other because there isn't just there isn't as much to sort of say it's this date, which I find really interesting. So there are potentially sites that are believed to be kind of late Roman in Britain, but might actually be late Anglo-Saxon. We just don't know because there's not enough there to say one way or the other.
Can I ask a noob question? Just because we use very similar terminology for different time periods. When is the Roman period in England? Because I've looked it up so many times, but I always get confused because I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's a bit earlier than what we use that term for here in Norway.
Yeah, sort of early 5th. So 5th century is when it sort of starts shifting into early Anglo-Saxon.
Okay, it's pretty, contemporaneous. Okay, I just got confused. Sometimes, like when I hear those type of labels, my internal timeline goes a bit like, I'm like, what country are we talking about?
So what I'd say is sort of late 500s to sort of early 700s. We've kind of got a really good idea of when that sort of Anglo-Saxon stuff. Sort of the Roman side, the late Anglo-Saxon side can be a bit vague. So I'm sort of reading through a lot of excavation reports where they're saying it's probably late Anglo-Saxon because there's no longer stuff, but it could also be early. We just don't have anything else to say. Yeah.
So is that a Christianity influence that it's like you don't need to be buried with your stuff because I guess you're going to get everything you need up there?
Yeah, it's really complicated and loads of people kind of suggest different things about it. So the main argument is that Christianity deprioritizes grave goods or objects in the grave. You kind of show kind of respect in other ways, sort of with the coffin burials associated with the church and whatnot. I would argue that perhaps we need to expand our idea of what grave goods mean and sort of what objects in the grave means, because a lot of these people are buried in sort of burial shrouds, so textiles and clothing that might not survive because textile doesn't do very well in soil. And it's that sort of question of, are we prioritizing metal objects and things that survive over more organic sort of textile-based objects? And they're still objects and goods and whatnot. It's just, has the focus shifted from metallic to organic material?
And probably the value we place on textiles today is so little compared to back then. It would, textiles would have been highly valuable. Whereas, we can get a t-shirt off Primark for £6. It's very different. So it probably shifts that mindset a lot for a lot of people where they don't have that same value for, a tapestry found.
Yeah, because one of the pieces of research that I do is sort of talking about when we get swords in graves, we're kind of usually more excited about a sword in a grave than a piece of jewelry, because we see a sword as a more active object versus jewelry being passive and something you wear. But actually, these are still really important items. These still sort of have a lot in people, sort of do a lot in people's day-to-day lives. And it's almost this, because jewelry is seen as more feminine, sometimes we don't talk about it as much. And I would say it's a similar thing for textiles in that if you're, putting the effort into making these textiles, you're taking these valuable resources out of living, use. That's quite an important act, putting jewelry in the grave, putting textiles in the grave. These are valuable objects. Taking them out of living circulation is a really sort of distinct act. And I would also argue that textiles are more feminine coded as well. Are we ignoring them because we just like the masculine 100%. Stuff? Yeah.
I actually read this is going a bit off topic, but just to your point, I read a really interesting article. It's not even that old, I think, about the Bayeux tapestry, where the author was talking about, I don't remember exactly what the article was called right now, but the article was talking about just kind of very passive, unnamed and non-specific female textile workers. And then they suddenly started talking about the designer of the Bayeux tapestry, and just out of freaking nowhere, it was very specifically a male gendered designer who was like a singular person who was the brains behind this entire thing. And not because I was like, burn all the bras or anything, but I was just sitting there going, what? But like, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I just find this very interesting because it seemed unconscious.
Do you think that's because they wouldn't know the names of the people that made it?
They didn't know the name
Whereas
of the designer either.
they did. Okay, so I was going to say, is it a case of that maybe they didn't know the names of the people that made it
Yeah,
because
because then I would be on board with it. But
Yeah.
it wasn't like no one was named, but it was just kind of like the women or like workers of this tapestry, and then he who designed this or the man who planned blah blah blah
oh, okay, I'm with you.
must
Yeah.
obviously have. And then I was just kind of going like, wait, what? So
Okay.
I think it is. I don't know if you've encountered this, Emma, but
Mm.
I find it interesting that even to this day, that there is, I would say, unquestionably a very much like a misogynistic undertone in a lot of stuff that's being done, but it's not necessarily conscious. So it's really
Mm.
hard to kind of approach it. Also, because, especially at least for me, in Scandinavia, which is lauded as being like super, gender
Mm.
neutral heaven or whatever, not the case, but that's discussion for
Yeah.
another day. That like if you talk about it like directly,
Mm.
people start scoffing a little bit and become a bit like, ugh, here comes the difficult one. Ugh.
Yeah, what I found really interesting was when I started doing my master's, which was specifically looking at relationships between rank and gender in Danish burials. Every time I told someone about it, I got sort of one or two reactions, which was, "Oh, you're looking for a feminist utopia," or you're looking to disprove some of the female warrior stuff. I think, and I don't know what it's like in sort of Scandinavia specifically, sort of in like Danish Norwegian sort of conversation, but I think particularly in Anglophone societies, we are really obsessed with Viking gender. Like there's just
We really are.
something about that really captures a lot of interest and a lot of sort of critical attention. This is kind of a tangent, but I have done a lot of research into kind of how the Viking Age and Old Norse societies are represented in tabletop role-playing games like D&D.
Ooh.
And what I was finding in loads of the English kind of campaign setting guides, they're really prescribing how gender should be role played out, which you don't get in other sort of historical settings to the same degree. Like loads of people were saying, well, women have to act like this. There's even sort of a game where there are feminine moves and masculine moves in the game. And I had a really interesting conversation with someone who speaks German and someone who speaks Norwegian, and they were saying this isn't happening in Viking setting books in those languages, but it's happening a lot in the English text. So I think there is a weird English obsession with Viking gender.
I want to get. I do want to get back on topic because there's two directions that I
Yeah.
want to go with it before we have to wrap up.
Mhm.
But I also want to take a stab at why I think this is,
Mhm.
because I think that this whole Viking sphere is a perfect melting pot for, you get an interest from like hypermasculine men who love the kind of warrior
Yeah.
ethos, and they love that. But you also have this area of female power as well in
Mhm.
the Valkyries or the Shield Maiden,
Yeah.
that also brings that attention. So you get sometimes, not everybody, but there is there's certainly this sect of hyper masculine men who are toxic, and they look at this idea of the strong female and will try and poke
Mhm.
holes in that where possible. But then it also brings in this idea of the strong female that then I guess is, I can't think of another culture really that you can kind of, that there is that kind of figurehead for a lot of women to get interested in and go,
Yeah.
okay, there is this idea of this warrior female that is, whether you believe in the graves or not, there is certainly the existence of Shield in the sagas and the Valkyries as a strong figure. So there is that thing that kind of brings people in. So you get this battleground between these that are really the hyper masculine ones, and then the probably more like, not even like the feminist side, but just women who are interested in it because of that. You get this kind of mix, and they just go on
Yeah.
loggerheads around this one culture, and it's really frustrating because
I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think if that's something that you tie to your identity, then if someone like from the hypermasculine side, of course being a bit generalizing here, but then if someone comes and for lack of a better term, fucks with that, then that becomes threatening, right? But I also think it's really interesting. Just I know again that this is off topic, but it does actually tie into the mortuary behavior. I think it's interesting also that we today emphasize strong women having then to have an attachment to some sort of militaristic or warrior-like behavior. Why is, but also actually on like when it comes to how we interpret biologically male graves, that power is synonymous with violence. But I think, does it have to be, is my question.
I think I mentioned this last time I was on, just briefly, but when we see female graves, as far as we know, they're sort of seen as female with swords, we're paying a lot of attention. If we're seeing male graves with jewelry, we're paying a lot less attention. And I just find it interesting, the focus there of like, oh, the masculine stuff with a woman, interesting, but not the other way around.
Do you think, and I was going to make this point earlier, do you think that's because the audience, for the most part, for this stuff is male? However we look at, like, most people, I guess, that are interested in the Vikings are like, I think male.
It's a bit like, well, isn't that
the audience in a way that if you push in stuff that's a little bit...
Are they though, or are the angry men just the people who make the most noise?
Possibly.
This is interesting because just going from my circles, and admittedly my circles are not indicative of kind of the general public, thinking about academics, the people I know who are doing Viking stuff are generally, I know more women than men doing it. But again, this is obviously a very specific sort of, sphere. So I don't know if more generally it's more men, but in terms of academia, I would say I see more women talking about this at the moment than...
Well, we have, there's tons of female guests on the podcast. So I think that's something, there are, every time I book a guest, there seems to be so many more women than men at the moment, especially when I'm looking. But from a business standpoint, from having, the company, we sell tons to, it's mainly men, or it seems to be women buying for their male partner. So I think maybe there is a thing on like an academic level, maybe a more of an inequality, but I think on an everyday layperson, there is... But
I would then be curious to look at the listenership of this podcast.
Yeah.
Is there a gendered thing? But
then again, I think this podcast is also, we've had some negative comments in the past for how like neutral and sometimes not like a feminist approach, but like being more
feminist
open.
Isn't bad.
No, but more like, but just more like open to like everything. Whereas, this podcast would probably have tons more listeners if it was very like that hyper masculine, male, Vikings are really cool. Let's talk just about the battles. Let's only talk about like the cool shit that the warriors did. Like, I'm sure we'd get loads more listeners because it would feed, what I think would feed an audience, versus what we try to do is just be very open.
That's actually really interesting.
Everything.
Yeah, I think that's really, but then I'm also curious on when it comes to, like, for example, your shop, because that is stuff that people would see, right? It's stuff that people would wear, that they would bring with them, or that they would have like out and about in their house. So is it then also emblematic of the type of persona people want to show that they are? And then does that kind of like, I think, okay, so to bring this back, when it comes to how the Viking Age is regarded today, but also how the Viking Age, whatever the fuck that was back in the day, no matter how you twist or turn it, it is an onion with infinite layers.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know we went on topic with gender there, but also it does come into
no, definitely,
the burial identification, because I would assume when you look at a grave, it's or certainly in the past it would be, if it's a sword, it's a male. If there's so that is a factor of it, that there is a thing of when you're looking and trying to figure out the sex of the person, those grave goods are certainly going to in some way determine one way or other, or at least like stereotypically.
Yeah, that's been the case for a really long time. We're kind of starting to move away from it. Not completely, because often it does like when you sort of sex estimate the skeletons and you match it to the grave goods, usually there is some correlation between feminine grave goods and masculine and sort of the biological sex.
For
Obviously,
those listening audibly here,
yeah,
quotation marks were used.
yeah, thank you. But sort of one thing that came out of my research is even though the grave goods, sort of feminine ones, matched, women who had been sexed as women, I don't think gender was the most important thing the grave was trying to say. I think it was more accidental or coincidental a lot of the time, in the sense of I was seeing more gender the higher the status of the individual. And what that could mean is gender more important to show at a certain sort of hierarchy of society? Is it more that they can afford to lose items like brooches that other people who maybe aren't as rich or don't have sort of the same resources had to keep in life? So I don't think the graves were often saying, this is a woman. I think it was kind of just this person was a high status individual. Oh, they probably were also a woman because they could give that item to the grave. I just don't think it's the most important thing that's being said a lot of the time, even though we focus on it. We sort of see jewelry and we go, right, immediately it's a woman, rather than looking at the other things first.
Mm-hmm. I think also it's possible that they probably didn't have the same focus and obsession with sex and gender that we have today, that they lived in a harder time when you had to work the farm, do your manual jobs, make sure everybody was fed. And it didn't really matter as much whether you were male, female. It was just, you just had to get on and everybody was kind of equal as long as you were pulling your weight. I'm sure nobody cared if you were a strong woman who carried all the hair for the animals, or nobody cared because you just had to eat. But let's get back to burials, because I have a few things that I want to look at. And one is, how do you identify things like Heath Moor, where you have, so for anybody that's just listening, if you haven't listened to the previous one with Emma, is a huge, I guess, like a cremation site.
Yeah, so Heath was a cremation, yeah.
So it's attributed to being Viking. Now, how on earth do you attribute a cremation site to being Viking?
So off the top of my head, it's a case of cremation at this point in England isn't really a thing. So seeing this mass cremation site, I think it's something like 57 mounds or something like that, is unusual. So it's this suggestion of, okay, well, we know that sort of the Viking army passed through here. It makes sense that this is sort of a cemetery for the dead there. Off the top of my head, I think they also had some burned animals in those graves, and they sort of trace those back to Scandinavia. So it's this case of seeing some chemical markers of Scandinavianness. And yeah, just at this point, burial mounds and cremation graves aren't a thing anymore. And it's obviously close to Repton and it's on the path of the Great Army. So that's where that kind of assumption came from.
Mm-hmm. Would that be the same for like mass burials? Because obviously there is the mass burial at Repton.
Yeah.
Again, if you see a mass grave like that, would you go, that's a Viking thing, or are Anglo-Saxons doing that as well?
I think mass burial, your first thought is, okay, what has happened that requires you to dump a whole load of people into one burial? And they sort of knew from this mass burial that this was a secondary burial for a lot of the people. So they'd been buried first or let to sort of decay first and then moved into this sort of mass space. Again,
interesting.
Yeah, so it's suggested that some of these people died elsewhere, were temporarily dealt with, so either buried temporarily or at least left to sort of skeletonize, and then brought to this one space, so at least they were all together. And kind of similar to what I said, chemical traces suggest Scandinavian. There's a few objects in that mass grave that sort of look Scandinavian. And I think, again, the animals, they've recently done the chemical analysis to suggest they're from Scandinavia. And obviously being so close to the other Repton graves as well gives you that kind of indication.
So it seems like you have to take into consideration a whole it's a whole
Yeah.
picture. There's no like
Yeah.
one thing that says. So what about if it's third,
Mhm.
second, third generation? So you can't do that analysis, I guess, on where the bones come from, or that you can't go back and say, right, this person originally came from Scandinavia. They were born, bred in Derbyshire. How do we then say this is of quote unquote Viking origin?
So you could nuance that. So the chemical markers on the skeleton might say they've grown up in Derbyshire because that's sort of the stuff they were consuming. But there is some initial work into genetics, so sort of seeing if they came from a genetic pool that matches Scandinavia more. So there's obviously still a lot of work to be done there. It's not a perfect science, but it gives you a little bit of an idea. And so that's kind of what the body would tell you. In terms of sort of everything else, maybe they had an amulet heirloom that's sort of in place in the grave that reflects sort of earlier origins. It could be certain burial practices. It is literally kind of, as you say, I think burial archaeology is really tricky because you kind of have to approach it from so many different angles. And sometimes when I tell people what they do, they're like, okay, do you specialize in the bones or do you specialize in the objects? And I'm like, no, I kind of just sit on top of everything and try to make it make sense.
Okay. Okay. Um, so what about when we get this period
Mhm.
where maybe they're third, fourth generation, and it's that real kind of middle point of
Yeah.
they're not really quite Viking anymore. They're pretty much whatever term Anglo-Saxon or whatever,
Yeah.
like they're this middle ground because I'm always this is a discussion we could go way deep on. It's like
Yeah.
that point of when somebody moves to a
Yeah.
new country, whether it's for whatever reason, at what point do they then become
Mhm.
from that country? Is it second
Yeah, at what
generation,
point are they
third,
one or the
fourth?
other?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Or are you always this mix? But surely not. Like everybody has come from somewhere at some point.
Yeah.
So yeah, how do you then identify that as you would like, oh, they're the Viking origin, or do you have to put like an asterisk on it?
I think if we're talking about sort of second or third generation at that point, we are into a new identity in a sense. It's
Mm-hmm.
not, it's kind of this hybrid, it's this kind of new communal identity. Like I'm just thinking of myself and people I know. So my mum's Danish. I was born in England. I still kind of identify as Danish, but probably come across as very English to a lot of people. And it's that case of that
like a third
nuance.
culture kid.
Yeah, that nuance isn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily going to translate into the grave, but we have to allow for the fact that it's sitting somewhere in the background. So my approach to something like that would be kind of looking more about hybrid communities rather than trying to say this is now Viking or Anglo-Saxon. Let's sort of explore, well, what is this Anglo-Scandinavian identity in this specific region functioning like compared to, let's say, somewhere up in York? What does an Anglo-Scandinavian identity look like up there?
Mm-hmm.
So it's less about are they Viking or are they Anglo-Saxon now? It's more how does this new communal identity look compared to somewhere else where we know that people are sort of
Okay.
merging and mingling.
It's all very complicated, isn't it?
It is. No, it is. It
It
hurts my brain a
is.
lot of the time.
Well, but I love that. I love when things are just not black or white or really
Yeah.
easy.
Because
And
that what makes it interesting, right? Because you can
Yeah.
keep
yeah.
talking about it.
Mhm.
That's why we're what, an hour and 15 minutes into this episode. That's why we've done a 200 and something episodes of the podcast, because it is such an
Yeah.
just an open time period where there's so many different opinions and thoughts and hypotheses. I'm trying to think when it comes to burial. So it seems as though the answer is there isn't really an individual marker to say this is a Viking grave. Then they're not buried with a bearded axe or something like that. Um, it's it's kind of, you have to look at the whole
Yeah.
entire picture. Now, what about like battle site burials? Now, I
Mhm.
don't really know how this works. When there's a battle and a bunch of people die, I would assume they don't all get buried. I'm not really too certain how it works. Now, if you had, a bunch of people on each side, they died. Maybe they are all taken to buried. I'm not sure. But if they're
Well, we do
not,
have two examples of that, not in England though,
but yeah, I'm thinking like if they're left, how would you decide both sides and who's who? And do we have? Is that even a? I don't even know if that's even a thing, if that exists.
People are probably definitely talking about it. I think it, again, sort of disappointingly, it's really hard to say because in theory, you would probably imagine that sort of each side of that fight would want to retrieve their dead and would want to sort of dispose of them in the way that makes sense for their culture. But firstly, they might not be able to go back and get all the dead, which means
if you lost the battle, I would assume that you can't really be like, excuse me, can we go and pick all these people up? Like you've kind of lost that area, I guess.
So then the question becomes, does the winning side have some sort of belief system or moral obligation to dispose of the dead, even though they're not their own dead? So you're kind of dependent upon what the other side are doing, because if they just leave them out exposed, animals are going to get to them. They're probably going to decay. We're probably not going to see that in the archaeological record.
And I guess the goods would be taken.
Yeah.
Especially if they're, someone's got a nice sword.
Yeah. And even if they are buried, the manner in which they're buried then wouldn't necessarily correspond to the cultural markers.
Yeah, and equally, I guess
would assume.
Could it be, depending on the winning side and the animosity between the two sides, it could be that they're like, well, fuck you guys, we're going to do the most disrespectful thing we can do with the bodies because we want to, maybe it's an ongoing war and we want to show dominance and we're going to disrespect the bodies in a certain way. Yeah,
it's really quite possible. And it's, again, depending on what they do with them, it kind of really sort of impacts whether that then shows in the archaeological record. Because let's say, really extreme example, like they sort of want to make a show of the dead. They cut them into pieces. Maybe they make objects out of the bone parts or something like that. They do weird things with them.
Now I'm interested.
Okay. Yeah.
Tell me about this.
Dan perking up right now.
Yeah. So I can talk about that more so without kind of the violence aspects. But one thing that the Body Politics Project at Leicester, which is sort of Viking, Iron Age, Scandinavian project, is that sometimes pieces of people, so bones, are then turned into objects. So one of the famous examples is there's a fragment of skull in Ribe, which is quite a big town in Denmark, which has got runes carved into it, and it's got a hole perforated. So maybe it was used as sort of an amulet for protection or whatnot. So it is possible that, the winning side took the dead and then turned the dead into something no longer human, something no longer body, but into objects. So that could mean that they don't show up as burials in the same way, or they might just dump them all into a pit, or it's really hard to say. And it's hard to say unless you've got those skeletons and you sort of do those chemical analyses or whatnot, whether that's the opposite side's war dead or it's their war dead that they've had to put into a mass burial. There's just so many different potentials happening there.
It all comes back to the notion of, which is my favorite quote from somewhere I don't remember, of the dead don't bury themselves.
Yes, that is Michael Parker Pearson, very famously.
Yeah. Thank you. Because I'm like, this really, really famous quote that I can never remember. Yeah. God damn. But we do have, disclaimer, I haven't read the news publication of the beefy ass book that came out this year, and I'm very sad about that. But there are, from the stuff that I have read, there is a suspicion of two possibly very early Viking / just before Viking Age potential post-battle mass graves, and those are the Estonian boat graves. For the simple reason that I'm just saying to Dan, for the simple reason that so many of the skeletal remains had a lot of really traumatic or they had trauma indicators, and then seemingly being buried, as far as I could tell, fairly quickly after those injuries occurred. But then again, it comes back to who buried them.
Yeah.
But then the burial indicators seem to indicate what today would be, people from Valsgärde, Swedish area.
Mm-hmm. I think we spoke about that in the last episode, Emma, how the burials sometimes tell you more about the people burying them than the actual person who's been buried.
Yeah, I mean, not even sort of a mass burial example, but just in terms of thinking about the amount of care that's gone into burying someone. I've got a coffin in my data set in Denmark where it's not very wide at all. It's about 20 centimeters wide, but it's an adult skeleton that's been pushed into this coffin. And you just think of like the average person is not only 20 centimeters wide. So it's either this case of did they have to
sideways?
Okay, so my phone is 16 centimeters long.
Yeah.
So like
So and like it's one of those pieces of data that you sort of look at and you're like, oh, and then you think about what that actually means in reality of like this coffin is only 20 centimeters wide, but this is an adult man as far as the skeleton says. That person has been shoved and like
aren't most skulls more than 20 centimeters wide?
Yeah. So it's this thing of like, did they have to bury them really quickly and that was the only coffin they had, or did they just not really care about this person at all?
Yeah, but who
even make a coffin
who just has a 20 centimeter coffin lying around? It's not
no,
like
exactly.
Like, why would that even have been made in a?
But then sort of let's say, okay, you probably don't have a 20 centimeter coffin lying around unless it's for a child, which says something else. But then it's a question of, well, then who intentionally made this tiny coffin for this person who shouldn't fit into this coffin?
We hate him.
Is it a coffin, or could it possibly have just been like a book? And that sounds
it could have been,
or just a box they had lying around that maybe
possibly
held the door in or something. I don't know, like a.
The one weird thing I found recently, which I'm still thinking over, so I'm doing a paper on sort of pillows or things that might have been used as pillows in Danish graves. And I've come across this example from Sebesund, which is northern Denmark, kind of later Viking period, where there is a suggestion that underneath a person's head as a potential pillow was the boiled bones of someone else.
Oh, that's the way my neck likes to rest.
You know, and I was like, oh, this doesn't feel as like cozy or
modern Tempur mattress.
Yeah, as other sort of pillows. But then I was thinking, like, is there kind of this intimate relationship between the person of the pillows versus, the person being buried? Yeah, that I'm still thinking that one.
That's the title. That is the title. Person of the pillows.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or the pillow person, the person pillow.
I like the way that they've boiled them as well to try and make them a little bit softer.
It's really interesting because
or to get the meat off.
No, but so as far as the text said, this body had been allowed to become a skeleton first and was then boiled. So it's not even like it was getting the skin off or anything. This body was sat around for a little while, became a skeleton, was then boiled and packed behind the other person's head.
People fascinating.
That's so cool.
No, I'm still thinking about that. Yeah.
Okay, here's the thing. I'm not saying that people in the past were weird, but just from our cultural perspective today, I love how weird people are. I love how weird we are.
Could you imagine having that as your dying wish? Like, I wish to be in a coffin and the pillow has to be someone else.
Honestly, probably my dog. I'd be like, could someone please make sure that my dog is my pillow?
This is what I mean, because I was looking at pillows with the perspective of, these are cozy, comfortable things. And I saw this bone pillow and went, well, that's the opposite of cozy. But then if you think about it, is there a relationship between the two people that actually makes this weirdly intimate and sort of sentimental?
I know, but you could have put the person like lying next to them, like a little embrace. I feel like there's a disrespect to the pillow. I don't know.
Maybe the first person had died a while before, because as I said, it became a skeleton.
Okay, yeah. And they were just like, fuck it, get them in there somehow.
Yeah, but then now I get really curious because it was just like a mention. There was no like drawing of how the bones were placed or anything.
No, so it's this one tiny paragraph. It's sort of in an excavation report. It's grave by grave by grave, and it just says very briefly, skeletonized, boiled leg, sort of bones behind head, suggesting it was a pillow because the other person's jaw was in a certain position. And it was the only time in the excavation report where we got a bit of like personal commentary where the excavator just put, why?
I mean, it's true. It's true.
Fair.
Yeah.
I really like that though. The person just going, I'm being super scientific, describing everything, but this is just too fucking weird.
Yep.
Why?
Yep.
But you know what? I was having this conversation, I think it was yesterday, about how even if you just look at burial cultures today amongst modern humans, you know, you've got everything from, you know, buried in a casket or cremated to cultures that dig their dead up after a couple of years to just hang out with them. You have cultures that before they bury them, they'll display them in a car or on a stage because they want to put them in a position that they loved in life. You have things like the Tibetan sky burial. You have all these insane
Didn't James Brown go on like a tour in a golden casket?
Maybe. I don't know. It's possible. But there's all these different. So if somebody, you know, in 200 years looked back on all the different ways we bury people, they'd be like, wow, people are really strange. Because I guess we fall into, I know we're talking about an isolated area of, you know, Scandinavia and the UK, but if you would have to apply that same logic that people are very different. So yes, there is maybe like an overarching like cultural norm. People don't always conform to the norm. We all know that. So if you were to look back, you know, 200, 300, 400 years at today's cultures and go, they're all humans, but the way they bury their dead is all very, very completely different. Some of them, you know, feed them to birds. Some of them bury them in the ground. Some of them get burned.
Yeah, I'd even go as far as to say I wonder if whether our kind of expectation of there even being a norm is not necessarily like, if is that starting out at the wrong end of the question?
So I think the answer I always give to, you know, Emma, isn't a bit morbid to study the dead all the time? Like, why do you study the dead? It's cool. It's cool, but it's one of the few things that every human experiences. You know, everyone dies, everyone deals with death, everyone, you know, as a society has to deal with the dead. So it's one of the few points where, you know, it is a universal human experience. So the fact that just looking at how loads of different people approach death is actually a really interesting way of looking at people generally, because it's something that everyone has to deal with versus some things which maybe are more contextually dependent.
Yeah, and it also kind of speaks to the fact that regardless of how we twist or turn it, death isn't one thing, and death isn't perceived as being one thing.
You touched on it earlier, and I actually want to wrap up on this, and we'll do a Q&A, and hopefully you can come back and talk about what I'm about to say.
I want to talk about boiled bone some more.
I'll give you some more thoughts on that later.
Yeah.
You mentioned it earlier about how just Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are different, because I think, again, I probably fall into this trap. The more I do the podcast and the more I learn, the more I guess I'm never going to call myself a scholar, but I go into that probably more scholarly thinking. Whereas the everyday person who just is interested in this stuff will just go, oh, well, everybody in Scandinavia probably thought the same. It's all Viking. They all did the same thing. It's all kind of one area, and it's easy just to lump Scandinavia as a place, and that's what it is. So I think it would be fun for you to come back, and then we could talk about how, and break it down into how those places, because we kind of looked mainly at England and how the burials in England have been today. So just look at how those different cultures, you know, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, how they buried their dead, and how they kind of dealt with it, and how it was different, and things like, I don't know if you look at the bog bodies. We've never really touched on that before.
A little bit. It's a little earlier than the Viking Age, but yeah, definitely an interesting continuation of practice.
But that idea of how even just, you know, really reduce it down into those areas and kind of explain to people how they're not all just Scandinavia.
I think that's
one unified thing.
I think that's a really good idea. Also, just because even within what today are the three separate countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Norway is different.
Yeah.
Like just the countries themselves didn't really necessarily exist.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
The way that we know them today. But then also within what those current geographical areas, there were so many differences.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing we kind of take for granted in the modern day is how much technology has bridged a lot of gaps, in the sense that we can go on the internet and find out what's going on in Australia very quickly. Back then, you'd have to take a boat for several weeks or days to find out what's going on elsewhere, for example. So the idea that everyone's doing the exact same thing despite not communicating in nearly the same way we are now is just, maybe a bit naive, unfortunately.
It is. And this is one thing
it's very ambitious.
Yeah. I come across this a lot with like runes when you get to discussion with people about runes, and it frustrates the life out of me that everybody thinks it's just one kind of way. There's one way to do it, and there weren't any regional differences. And when in reality, you're talking such a geographic area of a time period, and one person might have gone and taught somebody up in Norway, but they might have forgotten bits on the way, or they might have forgotten bits when they're there. Like if the person just didn't quite remember it fully, or something's different, or they just changed it regionally because it just fitted how they wanted to do it differently, that kind of branches off and makes its own little thing, and it's not all one cohesive.
Yeah, well, if we think about regional dialects now, chances are that's going to happen with the runes and sort of everything.
Yeah.
Like it's gonna be different sort of the further you get away from where it started.
Yeah, I transcribed some lab notes last year from 1916 with two different sets of handwriting, and just those two had very different ways of spelling the same words.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I didn't.
So
I picked up. We can finish this. I picked up the King James's demonology book. Is it King James? It is, isn't it? I think.
Oh.
But anyway, I'm pretty sure it is. It's from like 17 something, and I was looking at it, and just the way that they spell words, the same word on the same page differently. So there'd just be, the same word and it's spelled differently, like 10 words apart. So there's not even then there's not the same uniformed like writing system of like we spell this word this way, that is kind of different. And that's
so then of course runes would also then
absolutely
vary from person to person and place to place and time to time.
For sure. Okay, let's wrap this up, because I feel like we could just keep talking for ages. But Emma, please come back in the new year and we will talk about those burial practices in the different countries. It's always fun.
I love that.
And we will do a Q&A with the patrons and let them ask you some questions, and hopefully we can get a little bit weird with I want to hear the weird burial practices, because as we've established, I'm into the morbid side of things. But yeah, Emma, where can people find you, your work, anything you want to shout out?
Yeah, so I am ML Tom, so EMLTHOM on the artist formerly known as Twitter, and I am RK Emma on Instagram, so ARCHA Emma, and that's where I am. And there's a dog.
This is Rocco. He knows when it's time to wrap up. I don't know. He's like picked up. I don't know what it is, because I don't always say the same words, but he knows the end of the episode. So it must be like
the tone.
Yeah, it must be a tone in my voice, and he gets up and he's like,
up.
He's like, all right, guy, we're ready. I'm ready to go for a wee. So yeah, this is Rocco. He's making his little appearance. Max,
Ibsen's just laying on the couch over there, just looking at him, going, "Hey, I want to show you off," and he's just like, "Nah, I'm not moving."
No. Max, where can people find you?
When I do post, it's usually on Instagram. That's archaeomags, archaeo with a K.
Wonderful. And then for me, it's Daniel_Farrand1 on Instagram. I'm going to try and get more active with it. I've been terrible this year. Horns of Odin for the business. And then it's just Nordic Mythology podcast across the board, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. Do go on there and hit the little follow and the bell icon, or whatever you need to do. I think it's a subscribe button and a bell. Yeah, thank you very much, and we will see you next time.